Picture the rugged Arizona territory of 1885, where crimson sunsets paint endless mesas and ancient whispers carry across sagebrush plains. Imagine a world where blood determines destiny, where ancestral origins seal one's fate before a single word is spoken. In this unforgiving landscape of dust and distant mountains, one woman's Apache heritage becomes both her deepest burden and most unexpected salvation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena Blackwood stood at the street mirror in her rented room at Copper Springs' only boarding house, carefully arranging her long black hair to hide its distinctive texture. The afternoon light, filtering through dusty curtains, caught the raven sheen that marked her as different as dangerous to those who feared what they could not understand. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, pinning the thick locks into a style that might pass for fashionable rather than revealing her mother's bloodline. At 25, Elena possessed a quiet beauty that turned heads wherever she went. But it was a beauty that carried risk. Her high cheekbones and deep amber eyes spoke clearly of her Apache mother, while her fair complexion and delicate nose reflected her father's Scottish ancestry. This combination had cast her adrift between two worlds, too white for the Apache, too Indian for white society. She had learned to navigate this perilous existence through necessity, always aware that one careless moment could expose the truth that would destroy any chance at acceptance. The letter she had written 2 months ago lay open beside a chipped basin. The response, delivered yesterday by the stagecoach driver, was written in a steady, confident hand. Gabriel Harrison, owner of Shadow Rock Ranch in the remote Northern Territory, had accepted her proposal as a correspondence bride. His letter spoke of needing a capable wife to help manage his growing cattle operation and bring refinement to his frontier home. He had been impressed by her educated writing and teaching experience, never suspecting that beneath her carefully chosen words lay a heritage that would have immediately disqualified her. In his eyes, Elena had presented herself as the orphan daughter of Scottish immigrants, educated in Eastern schools and seeking a fresh start in the West. She had crafted this deception meticulously, perfecting every detail until it felt natural as breathing. The teaching experience was genuine enough. She had indeed taught the children of several wealthy families in Tucson, though they had believed her to be of Spanish descent rather than part Apache. Her fluency in English, Spanish, and her mother's native tongue had served her well, allowing her to adapt her story to whatever seemed most acceptable to her employers. The deception weighed on her conscience, but the alternative was a lifetime of scraping by in the shadows, taking whatever work she could find while hiding her true nature. She had witnessed too many of her mother's people struggle and die, caught between two worlds that offered no place for them. Her mother, Nara, had wisely taught her the ways of both cultures, preparing her for a life that would require constant adaptation and careful navigation of dangerous social waters. Nara Blackwood had been just 17 when she met William Blackwood during a trading expedition near Fort Bowie. Their love had been passionate but brief, ending when William was killed by bandits while traveling to secure supplies for their small homestead. Nara had hidden among Mexican settlements, knowing that a half-white child would face constant dangers. When Elena was born, Nara made the difficult decision to raise her daughter in the border towns, believing it would give the child better opportunities than life with the increasingly persecuted Apache bands. The years that followed had been a constant struggle for acceptance. Nara worked as a laundress and herbal healer, always moving when questions about her background grew too persistent. She taught Elena to read and write with fierce determination, saving every penny for books and paper, knowing that education would be her daughter's only shield against prejudice. When Nara died of fever 3 years earlier, Elena had been left truly alone, with nothing but her mother's teachings and her own quick mind to sustain her. The memory of her mother's final words still echoed in her thoughts. Hide when you must, but never forget who you are. Your blood carries stories older than these mountains. The boarding house around her stirred with afternoon activity boots on wooden floors, voices calling to one another, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen below. Elena knew she needed to leave soon to catch the northbound stage that would take her to Shadow Rock. She had sold almost everything she owned to afford the passage, keeping only a small trunk containing 2 good dresses. Her mother's turquoise pendant, her only connection to her Apache heritage, and the precious collection of books that had been her refuge through lonely years. As she finished her preparations, Elena caught sight of herself one final time in the mirror. The woman looking back appeared entirely respectable, even refined. Her dark green traveling dress was well made, though not expensive. Her hair was styled fashionably, and her posture spoke of good breeding and education. No one looking at her would immediately suspect her dangerous secret, and she had become expert at deflecting questions about her family with vague references to deceased parents and distant relatives in the East. The stage station was already crowded when Elena arrived, her small trunk carried by a young boy she had paid a nickel. The other passengers a cattle buyer returning north, an elderly couple visiting their daughter, and a stern-faced man who appeared to be a mining engineer, barely glanced at her as she took her assigned seat. This was always the most dangerous time, those first moments when people formed their impressions. Elena had learned to project an air of quiet respectability that discouraged personal questions, while still appearing friendly enough to avoid suspicion. The journey to Shadow Rock would take nearly 4 days with stops in several smaller settlements along the way. Each stop would bring new challenges, new opportunities for someone to ask the wrong questions or notice something that didn't align with her carefully constructed story. But Elena had been preparing for this moment for years, and she was determined not to let fear derail her only chance at building a real life for herself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the stage lurched into motion, carrying her away from the only life she had known, Elena allowed herself a moment of doubt. What would happen when Gabriel Harrison discovered the truth about her heritage? Would he be like so many others, immediately rejecting her once he learned of her Apache blood? Or might he be different, a man capable of seeing beyond the prejudices that had shaped her entire existence? The landscape rolling past the stage window was harsh but beautiful copper-hued canyons and vast stretches of sagebrush, broken by stands of pinyon pine. This was the country where her mother had been born, where the Apache had once moved freely before being confined to reservations. Elena felt a deep connection to this land that she could never fully express, a sense of belonging that transcended the social barriers that had defined her life. During stops at way stations, she observed the other travelers and listened to their conversations, gathering information about the territory she was entering. Shadow Rock, she learned, was a relatively new settlement, established only 5 years earlier by ranchers seeking fresh grazing land for their cattle. The town was small but growing, with a general store, a saloon, a small church, and perhaps 20 families spread across the surrounding valley. Gabriel Harrison, according to a conversation she overheard between the cattle buyer and the mining engineer, was something of a local success story. He had arrived in the territory with little more than determination and a small herd of cattle, building his ranch through hard work and shrewd business decisions. He was respected by his neighbors, known for his fair dealings and willingness to help other settlers during difficult times. But he was also known to be particular about respectability, expecting his ranch hands to conduct themselves properly and his home to reflect civilized values. This information both encouraged and worried Elena. A man who valued respectability might appreciate her education and refinement, but he would also be exactly the type to reject her immediately if he discovered her mixed heritage. She would need to be extremely careful, at least until she could prove her worth as a wife and partner. Perhaps if she demonstrated her value to his ranch and his life, he might be willing to overlook her background when the truth inevitably emerged. The other concern weighing on her mind was the reaction of the Shadow Rock community itself. Small frontier towns could be particularly suspicious of outsiders, especially those who didn't fit neatly into established categories. She would need to quickly establish herself as a respectable member of the community, contributing to church activities and social gatherings, while carefully maintaining her fabricated background. As the stage continued its northward journey, Elena found herself rehearsing her story once again. She was the daughter of Scottish immigrants who had died in a fever outbreak when she was 16. She had been raised by family friends who had educated her in exchange for helping with their younger children. When they had relocated to California, she had remained in Arizona to pursue teaching opportunities. It was a story with just enough truth to feel natural and just enough tragedy to discourage too many follow-up questions. The turquoise pendant hidden beneath her high collar seemed to grow heavier with each mile, a tangible reminder of the heritage she was denying. Her mother had worn it every day of her life, and it had been passed down through generations of women in her family. The small stone was set in silver with intricate designs that told stories of courage and perseverance. Wearing it felt like carrying a piece of her mother's spirit with her, but it also represented the greatest threat to her carefully constructed new identity. On the third day of travel, as they approached the final stage before Shadow Rock, disaster nearly struck. During a stop at a trading post, an old Apache woman selling woven baskets approached Elena with a look of recognition. The woman began speaking to her in the Apache language, clearly seeing through Elena's careful disguise to the heritage beneath. The other passengers watched with interest as Elena politely but firmly responded in Spanish, pretending not to understand the woman's words. The incident passed without serious consequence, but it served as a stark reminder of how easily her deception could unravel. That night, staying at a rough inn that served the stage route, Elena lay awake, listening to the sounds of the frontier night coyotes calling in the distance, the wind whispering through junipers, the occasional stamp of horses in the corral. Tomorrow she would reach Shadow Rock and meet the man who would become her husband. She had spent months imagining this moment, trying to prepare herself for every possible scenario. But now that it was almost upon her, she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was attempting. Would she spend her entire married life hiding her true self from her husband? Could any genuine connection be built on such a foundation of deception? Yet what choice did she have? In a world that judged her unworthy based solely on her bloodline, truth was a luxury she couldn't afford. The final morning of travel dawned, clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made distant mountains appear close enough to touch. Shadow Rock, when it finally came into view, was smaller than Elena had expected, but more established looking than many frontier settlements. The main street was wide and reasonably well maintained, lined with sturdy wooden buildings that spoke of a community planning for permanent growth. As the stage rolled to a stop in front of the general store, Elena caught her first glimpse of the man who would shape her future. Gabriel Harrison stood waiting beside a well-maintained wagon, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the morning sun. Even from a distance, she could see that he was younger than she had expected, perhaps 32, with the kind of weathered good looks that came from a life spent outdoors. His clothing was practical but well-made, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to responsibility. But there was something else about him, something that made Elena's breath catch as she stepped down from the stage. In his features, she recognized the subtle signs of mixed heritage, the slight prominence of his cheekbones, the bronze undertones in his skin, the way his dark hair caught the light. Gabriel Harrison, she realized with a shock of recognition. And Hope was not the pure-blood white rancher she had expected to meet. He was like her, caught between two worlds, walking the careful line between acceptance and exposure. And in that moment, as their eyes met across the dusty main street of Shadow Rock, Elena wondered if perhaps her desperate gamble might lead not just to survival, but to something far more precious: understanding from someone who truly knew the burden she carried. The moment stretched between them like a taut thread, filled with unspoken recognition. Gabriel Harrison's dark eyes searched Elena's face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, not from fear but from the startling realization that she might be looking at someone who understood the delicate balance she maintained daily. "Miss Blackwood?" His voice carried a slight depth that matched his appearance, controlled but resonant. When she nodded, he stepped forward with measured grace, removing his hat to reveal thick dark hair that caught the sunlight. "Welcome to Shadow Rock. I'm Gabriel Harrison." His handshake was firm but brief, and Elena noticed the calluses that spoke of years of ranch work. More importantly, she noticed how his gaze lingered on her face, as if he were reading something there that others missed. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Harrison," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "Your letters painted such a vivid picture of this country. It's even more beautiful than I imagined." The words came easily, a necessary social courtesy, but she could see in his expression that he heard something deeper. Perhaps it was the way she pronounced certain words, or maybe the slight emphasis she placed on country rather than town. Whatever it was, she sensed his growing awareness that she, like him, carried secrets beneath her carefully constructed exterior. "Allow me to help you with your trunk," Gabriel said, already moving toward the stage where her modest belongings waited. The ease with which he lifted the heavy case spoke of considerable strength, but it was the gentle care he took in handling her possessions that caught her attention. This was a man accustomed to treating valuable things with respect, even when that value might not be immediately apparent to others. As they walked toward his wagon, Elena became acutely aware of the attention their meeting was drawing from the residents of Shadow Rock. Several women had emerged from the general store and were watching with barely concealed curiosity, their whispered conversations creating a soft buzz of speculation. She recognized the look in their eyes, the careful assessment that determined whether a newcomer would be accepted into their community or forever marked as an outsider. Mrs. Judith Montgomery, the minister's wife and unofficial social arbiter of Shadow Rock, approached with a determined smile. The woman's silver hair was pulled back in a severe style, and her dark blue dress spoke of Eastern sensibilities transplanted to the frontier. Everything about her demeanor suggested she considered herself the guardian of the town's moral standards. "Mr. Harrison," Mrs. Montgomery said with forced warmth, "you simply must introduce us to your charming guest." The emphasis on guest carried just enough weight to make clear her expectation that proper courtship protocols would be observed, correspondence bride arrangement notwithstanding. "Mrs. Montgomery, may I present Miss Elena Blackwood," Gabriel replied with careful formality. "Miss Blackwood has traveled from Tucson to consider my proposal of marriage." His directness clearly surprised Mrs. Montgomery, who had evidently expected a more gradual revelation of their arrangement. Elena curtsied slightly, drawing on years of observing proper social behavior. "I'm delighted to meet you, Mrs. Montgomery. Mr. Harrison's correspondence has given me such hope for finding a true home here in Shadow Rock." Mrs. Montgomery's sharp eyes studied Elena's face with uncomfortable intensity, clearly trying to place her features within some familiar category. "Blackwood," she mused aloud. "I don't believe I'm familiar with that family name. Are you perhaps related to the Blackwoods of Denver?" The question was a trap, designed to establish Elena's social credentials and family connections. "I'm afraid not," Elena replied smoothly. "My parents were Scottish immigrants who settled briefly in eastern Arizona before fever took them." She allowed just enough sadness to enter her voice, to discourage further questions about her family. "How tragic," Mrs. Montgomery said with what might have been genuine sympathy. And you've been managing on your own since then? Such courage. For one so young. The compliment carried an undertone of suspicion. In Mrs. Montgomery's world, respectable young women did not travel unaccompanied across dangerous territory to marry strangers. Miss Blackwood has been supporting herself as a teacher, Gabriel interjected, his tone carrying a subtle warning. Her education and accomplishments speak well of her character. It was a gentle but firm defense, and Elena felt a surge of gratitude for his intervention. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Mrs. Montgomery probing delicately for information about Elena's background while Gabriel deftly redirected the most invasive questions. Finally, citing the need to reach his ranch before sunset, he guided Elena toward his wagon with polite but unmistakable finality. As they drove away from the settlement, the tension that had gripped Elena's shoulders began to ease slightly. The immediate social trial was behind her, though she knew it was only the first of many such encounters she would face. Shadow Rock appeared to be the type of community where everyone's business was considered everyone else's concern, and establishing her respectability would require constant vigilance. Mrs. Montgomery means well, Gabriel said after they had traveled in comfortable silence for several minutes. But she tends to view any change to our community with suspicion. Don't let her manner discourage you. I've encountered her type before, Elena replied carefully. I understand the need to protect one's community from undesirable influences. She chose her words deliberately, curious to see how he would respond to the implicit acknowledgement of the social dynamics at play. Gabriel's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins. Sometimes the people we're protecting ourselves from are the ones who understand us best, he said quietly. The comment hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that neither was quite ready to address directly. The landscape they traveled through was breathtaking in its stark beauty. Rolling hills covered in native grasses stretched toward distant mesas, while ancient juniper trees marked the paths of hidden streams. This was land that had been shaped by wind and weather into something that spoke to the soul rather than merely pleasing the eye. Elena found herself responding to it in ways that surprised her, a deep sense of rightness, as if she were finally seeing the country that matched something fundamental in her nature. Your letters mentioned cattle ranching, she said, seeking safer conversational ground. Have you been in this business long? About 7 years now, Gabriel replied, his voice warming as he discussed his work. I started with a small herd, and barely enough money for supplies. The land here wasn't considered prime grazing territory, which made it affordable for someone like me. Again, that careful phrasing suggested layers of meaning beneath the surface. Someone like you? Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, studying the horizon as if weighing his words carefully. Someone without the family connections or established reputation that usually makes success in this business easier, he finally said. I've had to prove myself through results rather than relationships. It was a diplomatic way of acknowledging the barriers he had faced without directly admitting to the heritage that likely created them. Elena recognized the careful balance. He was maintaining honest enough to be truthful, vague enough to avoid dangerous specifics. She had spent years perfecting similar verbal dances herself. Hard work and determination can overcome many obstacles, she said, offering support without pushing for details he wasn't ready to share. Your success speaks well of your character. The ranch, when it finally came into view, exceeded Elena's expectations in every way. The main house was a substantial structure built from local stone, with a wide covered porch that promised cool evenings and protection from summer storms. Outbuildings dotted the landscape in logical arrangements. Large barn, several corrals, a bunkhouse for ranch hands, and what appeared to be a workshop. Everything spoke of careful planning and steady prosperity. But what struck Elena most powerfully was how the ranch seemed to blend into the natural landscape, rather than imposing itself upon it. The buildings were positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks and water sources, while the corrals were placed to minimize impact on the native vegetation. This was the work of someone who understood and respected the land rather than simply seeking to exploit it. "It's magnificent," she said, and for once, the praise was entirely genuine. "You've built something remarkable here." Gabriel's pleasure at her reaction was obvious, though he tried to downplay his accomplishment. "The land did most of the work. I just tried not to interfere with what it wanted to become." The comment revealed more about his philosophy than perhaps he intended. This was a man who believed in working with natural forces rather than against them, a perspective that resonated deeply with the teachings Elena's mother had passed down from her Apache ancestors. Several ranch hands had gathered near the main corral to observe their arrival, their curious glances taking in every detail of Elena's appearance. She recognized the mixture of respect and wariness in their expressions. These men clearly held their employer in high regard, but they were protective of his interests and suspicious of potential threats to his well-being. The foreman, a weathered man with kind eyes and graying hair streaked with silver, stepped forward to greet them. "Miss, this here's Thomas Rivera," Gabriel said by way of introduction. "He keeps this place running when I'm too stubborn to listen to good advice." Rivera's smile was genuine as he removed his hat respectfully. "Senorita Blackwood, welcome to Shadow Rock Ranch. We have been curious to meet the lady who captured our boss's attention through mere letters." His slight accent and comfortable familiarity with Gabriel suggested a relationship built on mutual respect rather than mere employment. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Rivera," Elena replied in flawless Spanish, then continued in English. "Mr. Harrison's letters spoke often of his excellent crew." It's clear he wasn't exaggerating. The brief exchange in Spanish had an interesting effect on the gathered men. Several exchanged meaningful glances, while Rivera's expression shifted to one of surprised approval. Gabriel, she noticed, was watching her with new intensity, clearly processing this additional piece of information about her background. "You speak Spanish beautifully," he commented as Rivera helped them unload her trunk. "Where did you learn?" This was dangerous territory, requiring her to venture closer to the truth than she preferred. "The family who took me in after my parents died included several Mexican members," she said carefully. "They were very kind to me, and I picked up the language naturally." It was true enough, though it omitted the more complex reality of her mother's relationships with various communities along the frontier. Nara Blackwood had been skilled at finding sanctuary with Mexican families, who were more accepting of mixed marriages and children of uncertain parentage. As they approached the main house, Elena caught sight of a figure watching from an upstairs window, a woman with silver-streaked dark hair and sharp features who disappeared from view as soon as she realized she had been observed. The brief glimpse suggested someone older, perhaps a housekeeper or relative, though Gabriel had mentioned no family members in his letters. "That would be Mrs. Maria Diaz," Gabriel explained, having followed her glance. "She's been managing the household since I built this place. Her husband worked for me in the early days, and when he passed, she stayed on. She claims the house would fall apart without her supervision, and I've learned not to argue with her assessment." The fondness in his voice suggested a relationship based on genuine affection rather than mere convenience. It also hinted at Gabriel's character, a man who honored loyalty and cared for those who depended on him. Qualities that Elena found deeply appealing after years of uncertainty. Mrs. Diaz met them at the front door, her stern expression softening slightly as she studied Elena with shrewd but not unkind eyes. Unlike Mrs. Montgomery's suspicious probing, the older woman's assessment seemed focused on practical matters. Was this newcomer someone who would treat her employer well and contribute positively to the household? "Senorita," she said with formal politeness, "your room is prepared. Would you prefer to rest from your journey, or would you like to see the house first?" "I'd love to see the house, if that wouldn't be an imposition," Elena replied. Mr. Harrison's descriptions made me quite curious about his home. Mrs. Diaz nodded approvingly. Clearly, this was the correct answer from someone who might become mistress of the household. As they toured the rooms, Elena was struck by the thoughtful details throughout the house. The furniture was well made but comfortable, clearly chosen for durability and function rather than mere display. Books lined the shelves in the main room, suggesting an educated owner who valued learning. Most remarkably, subtle decorative elements throughout the house showed influences that transcended purely European traditions. Woven baskets that spoke of native craftsmanship, textiles that reflected Mexican artistry, and architectural details that suggested someone who appreciated beauty regardless of its cultural origins. The guest room where she would stay was spacious and comfortable, with large windows that provided stunning views of the surrounding landscape. Mrs. Diaz had placed fresh wildflowers in a simple vase on the bedside table, a touch that spoke of genuine hospitality rather than mere obligation. Dinner will be ready in an hour, Mrs. Diaz announced as she prepared to leave Elena to settle in. We eat simply here, but there is always plenty. She paused at the door, studying Elena with the direct gaze of someone accustomed to making quick but accurate judgments about character. Senator Harrison is a good man, she said finally. He deserves happiness. The comment was both a welcome and a warning. Mrs. Diaz was prepared to accept Elena into the household, but any betrayal of her employer's trust would not be tolerated. It was a position Elena could respect and appreciate, even as it added another layer of pressure to her already precarious situation. Alone in the room, Elena finally allowed herself to fully process the extraordinary developments of the day. Not only had she successfully navigated the initial social challenges of arriving in Shadow Rock, but she had discovered that Gabriel Harrison shared the burden of concealed heritage that had shaped her entire existence. The recognition she had seen in his eyes, the careful way he spoke about his background, the subtle evidence of mixed cultural influences throughout his home, everything pointed to a man who, like her, had learned to walk the dangerous line between authenticity and acceptance. But this revelation, while offering hope for understanding and connection, also brought new dangers. If Gabriel's own position in the community was more precarious than it appeared, her presence might threaten the careful balance he had achieved. And if her deception was discovered, it would not only destroy her own prospects, but potentially damage his standing as well. As she unpacked her few belongings, carefully hiding her mother's turquoise pendant beneath her other modest jewelry, Elena found herself facing a dilemma she had not anticipated. She had come to Shadow Rock expecting to perpetuate her deception indefinitely, maintaining her fabricated identity until it became so established that the truth could never surface. But the possibility of genuine connection with someone who might actually understand her struggle introduced complications she had never considered. Could she build a real marriage on the foundation of a lie, even if that lie was designed to protect them both? And more importantly, did she have the right to make that choice for Gabriel, who clearly had his own reasons for maintaining careful boundaries around his personal history? The sound of approaching horses drew her to the window, where she observed several riders arriving at the ranch. Even from a distance, she could sense tension in their posture and urgency in their movements. Whatever news they brought was clearly not welcome, and Elena felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. In her experience, unexpected visitors rarely brought good fortune to those already walking on dangerous ground. The riders brought news that changed everything. From her window, Elena watched as Gabriel strode across the yard to meet them, his easy confidence replaced by a tension she could feel even at this distance. The lead rider, a man wearing a badge that caught the late afternoon sun, dismounted with the weary movements of someone who had been traveling hard for days. Their conversation was brief but intense, punctuated by sharp gestures toward the northern horizon, where storm clouds were gathering, both literally and figuratively. When Gabriel returned to the house 20 minutes later, his face carried the weight of unwelcome revelations. Mrs. Diaz appeared instantly, as if she had been waiting just out of sight, her experienced eyes reading trouble in every line of his posture. The whispered exchange between them was conducted in rapid Spanish, too quick for Elena to follow completely, but she caught enough words to understand that danger was approaching their peaceful valley. "Miss Blackwood," Gabriel called up the stairs, his voice carefully controlled. "Would you join me in the study? There are matters we need to discuss." The formal tone sent a chill through Elena's chest. During their journey from town, she had grown accustomed to the warmth that seemed to underlie his every interaction with her. This sudden distance suggested that whatever news the riders had brought directly affected her presence at the ranch. She found him standing before the large stone fireplace, one hand braced against the mantelpiece as he stared into the cold ashes from the previous evening's fire. The late afternoon light streaming through the tall windows illuminated the tension in his shoulders and the grim set of his jaw. When he turned to face her, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch not suspicion exactly, but a careful evaluation that suggested he was seeing her with new clarity. "The man who just left was Sheriff Mason," Gabriel began, without preamble. "He's tracking a band of renegades who've been raiding settlements throughout the territory. The leader is a half Apache named Victor Redhawk, and they believe he may be heading this direction." Elena's blood turned to ice. Victor Redhawk had been her mother's cousin, a man who had chosen violence over accommodation when the Apache were forced onto reservations. The last time she had seen him, she was 12 years old, and he was warning her mother that their attempts to live among white settlements would eventually bring disaster. His prediction had proven terrifyingly accurate. "That name means something to you," Gabriel observed, his sharp eyes missing nothing in her expression. It wasn't a question. Elena struggled to find words that wouldn't expose too much while still being truthful. "I may have heard it mentioned years ago. There were stories about raiders near Tucson, but I thought those troubles had ended." Gabriel studied her face for a long moment, and she could practically see him weighing her words against his own knowledge and suspicions. "The sheriff was very specific about Redhawk's methods," he said carefully. "He has a particular hatred for mixed-blood families who try to integrate into white communities, considers them traitors to their heritage." The implication hung in the air between them like smoke-thick, choking, and impossible to ignore. Gabriel knew exactly what Victor's presence in the territory meant for anyone carrying native blood, and his careful phrasing suggested he was offering her an opportunity to reveal her own situation before circumstances forced the truth into the open. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there are things about my background that I haven't been entirely forthcoming about. I never intended to deceive you maliciously, but survival sometimes requires careful editing of the truth," he finished gently. "I understand that necessity better than you might imagine." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her completely. She had been prepared for anger, rejection, even disgust, but not for this patient understanding that spoke of his own familiarity with impossible choices. "My mother was Apache," she said simply, the truth falling into the space between them like stones into still water. "My father was a Scottish trader who never returned for us. I've spent my entire adult life hiding that heritage because I learned early that honesty about such things is a luxury I couldn't afford." Gabriel nodded slowly, as if her confession confirmed suspicions he had been harboring since their first meeting. "My grandmother was Navajo," he said quietly. "My grandfather met her after being wounded in a skirmish. She saved his life. They married against everyone's wishes and spent years facing hatred from both sides. My father inherited that burden, and now it falls to me." The relief that flooded through Elena was so intense it left her lightheaded. Not only did Gabriel understand her deception, but he shared the fundamental challenge that had shaped her entire existence. They were both products of two worlds, forever walking the knife edge between acceptance and exposure. The sheriff doesn't know about your heritage? She asked. Law enforcement tends to be more pragmatic than local communities, Gabriel replied. They care more about results than bloodlines, as long as you're on the right side of their investigations. But that tolerance has limits, especially when dealing with Indian troubles. A new thought struck Elena with sickening force. If Victor Redhawk is targeting mixed families, and if he somehow learns of my presence here, he could use your ranch to draw me into a confrontation. Or worse, Gabriel finished grimly, he might see both of us as exactly the kind of traitors he's dedicated his life to punishing. Mrs. Diaz appeared in the doorway as if summoned by their mutual distress, carrying a tea service that neither of them had requested, but both desperately needed. Her dark eyes moved between them with shrewd understanding, and Elena realized that the older woman had probably known the truth about both their backgrounds from the beginning. Thomas is bringing the cattle closer to the ranch, Mrs. Diaz reported as she set down the tray. The men are establishing guard positions at the boundary markers. They are good workers, but they are not soldiers. How long before Redhawk reaches this area? Elena asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. The sheriff estimates 2 days, maybe 3 if they stop to raid the Wilson place, Gabriel replied. That gives us time to make preparations, but not enough to get you safely away from here. I'm not leaving, Elena said firmly, surprising herself with the vehemence of her declaration. Running would only confirm his suspicions about me, and it would leave you to face this threat alone. Gabriel's expression shifted to something that might have been admiration mixed with exasperation. Miss Blackwood, Elena, you don't understand what you're suggesting. Redhawk isn't just a raider. He's a man driven by a very specific kind of hatred, and that hatred focuses particularly on women like you who have chosen to live among white communities. Then perhaps it's time someone stood up to that hatred, she replied, her mother's stubborn courage rising in her chest like a tide. I've spent my entire life hiding from who I am, letting fear dictate every choice I make. Maybe that changes now. Mrs. Diaz made a sound that might have been approval or concern, while Gabriel ran a hand through his hair in obvious frustration. This isn't about courage, Elena. It's about survival, and survival sometimes means choosing your battles carefully. I chose my battle the moment I stepped off that stage in Shadow Rock, she said quietly. I chose it when I decided to stop running from my heritage and start looking for a place where it might actually be accepted. The conversation was interrupted by the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. Thomas Rivera burst through the front door. Without ceremony, his usually calm demeanor replaced by urgent alarm. Patron, riders approaching from the east. Not Redhawk's band, but their flying cavalry colors. Gabriel's jaw tightened. Captain Sullivan? He asked grimly. See, looks like your brother-in-law has finally decided to pay a visit. Elena felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Gabriel had never mentioned having a brother-in-law, much less one in the military. The careful way Rivera had phrased his announcement suggested this was not a welcome family reunion. Your brother-in-law is a cavalry officer? She asked. Captain James Sullivan, currently stationed at Fort Verde, Gabriel replied, his voice flat with suppressed emotion. He married my sister Rebecca 5 years ago. We haven't spoken in nearly 3 years, not since he made it clear that my choice to acknowledge my heritage was an embarrassment to their social standing. Through the window, Elena could see a small column of soldiers approaching the ranch house. The officer leading them sat his horse with military precision, his uniform crisp despite the long ride. Even at a distance, she could see that he carried himself with an authority that seemed designed to intimidate. He's heard about Redhawk, Gabriel said grimly. The question is whether he's here to help or to make sure I don't complicate the Army's efforts to capture him. Captain James Sullivan dismounted with parade ground precision, handing his reins to one of his men before striding toward the house. His gaze swept the ranch buildings with professional assessment, noting defensive positions and potential vulnerabilities. When his eyes fell on Elena standing beside Gabriel, she saw a flicker of surprise followed by what might have been concern. "Gabriel," he said with formal politeness as he climbed the porch steps, "I see you have company." "Miss Elena Blackwood," Gabriel replied with equal formality. "My intended bride." "Elena, this is my brother-in-law, Captain Sullivan." The introduction hung in the air like a challenge. Sullivan's sharp eyes studied Elena's face with uncomfortable intensity, clearly cataloging features and drawing conclusions about her heritage. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated by his obvious suspicions. "Miss Blackwood," Sullivan said with a slight bow, "I trust your journey to Shadow Rock was pleasant." "Quite pleasant, thank you," she replied smoothly. "Your brother-in-law has been most welcoming, I'm sure he has." The comment carried an undertone that suggested Sullivan's opinion of Gabriel's hospitality was not entirely favorable. "Gabriel, we need to talk privately." "Anything you need to say to me can be said in front of Miss Blackwood," Gabriel replied evenly. "She's going to be part of this family after all." Sullivan's expression tightened. "Very well. I'm here because Washington is concerned about the deteriorating situation in this territory. Red Hawk's raids are drawing unwanted attention from Eastern newspapers, and there's pressure to resolve this matter quickly and decisively." "Meaning?" Gabriel prompted. "Meaning the Army is prepared to offer a substantial reward for information leading to Red Hawk's capture or death. We're also prepared to provide protection for any civilians who might be targeted because of their connections to the situation." The euphemism was delicate but unmistakable. Sullivan was offering to protect his brother-in-law and Elena because of their mixed heritage, but only if they cooperated with military objectives that might conflict with their own survival strategies. "And what would that cooperation entail?" Gabriel asked carefully. "Full disclosure of any contact you might have had with Red Hawk or his associates. Complete transparency about your activities in this territory. An assurance that you won't interfere with military operations, even if those operations involve actions you might find personally objectionable." Elena felt ice forming in her stomach. Sullivan was essentially asking them to betray any Apache who might seek shelter or assistance, regardless of their involvement with Red Hawk's raiding. It was the kind of blanket collaboration that would destroy any remaining connections to their native heritage while potentially endangering innocent people. "I appreciate the Army's concern," Gabriel said with dangerous quiet, "but I've managed to survive in this territory for 7 years without compromising my principles. I don't intend to start now." Sullivan's patience visibly frayed. "This isn't about principles, Gabriel. It's about reality. Red Hawk has made it clear that he considers people like you to be legitimate targets. Your ranch, your livestock, his gaze flicked toward Elena, household are all at risk." "Then I'll defend them," Gabriel replied simply. "Against a war band of experienced fighters?" With a handful of ranch hands, and Sullivan's eyes narrowed as he studied Elena again. "Whatever assistance Miss Blackwood might provide." The insult was subtle but unmistakable, and Elena felt her temper flare. "I may not be a soldier, Captain Sullivan, but I'm not helpless either," she said, her voice steady despite her anger. "And I certainly won't be responsible for seeing Gabriel compromise his integrity to satisfy military expedience." Sullivan's eyebrows rose slightly at her spirited response. "Miss Blackwood, I mean no disrespect, but this situation is more dangerous than you realize. Red Hawk doesn't distinguish between combatants and civilians when it comes to people he considers traitors to their heritage." "Then perhaps," Elena said quietly, "it's time someone taught him that heritage isn't defined by hatred or by hiding from who we are." The challenge in her words was unmistakable, and both men stared at her with expressions of mingled admiration and alarm. She had essentially declared her intention to stand and fight rather than flee or compromise. A position that would force them all to confront the fundamental question of how much they were willing to sacrifice to maintain their carefully constructed lives. Sullivan looked between his brother-in-law and Elena with growing frustration. "You're both going to get yourselves killed," he said bluntly. "And when that happens, the army will have no choice but to treat this ranch as a hostile position that aided and abetted known renegades." "Is that a threat, James?" Gabriel asked softly. "It's a warning," his brother-in-law replied. "The same warning I would give to anyone foolish enough to think they can face this situation alone." But as the two men faced each other across the widening gulf of their different choices, Elena realized that none of them truly understood the full scope of the danger approaching Shadow Rock. Victor Redhawk wasn't just a renegade raider seeking revenge against mixed-blood families. He was a man who had lost everything to the advancing tide of white settlement, and who now saw the destruction of those who tried to bridge both worlds as his sacred mission. And somewhere in the gathering darkness beyond the ranch boundaries, he was coming for them all. The tension that had been building since Captain Sullivan's arrival reached a breaking point the following morning when Thomas Rivera discovered fresh tracks along the northern boundary of the ranch. The unshod hoofprints and distinctive markings told a story that chilled everyone who could read such signs. Victor Redhawk's scouts had been watching Shadow Rock Ranch throughout the night, cataloging defenses and counting the number of people inside the compound. Elena stood in the ranch kitchen beside Mrs. Diaz, methodically cleaning and checking the small arsenal of weapons that had been assembled on the sturdy wooden table. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, a skill learned during the dangerous years when her mother had moved them frequently between settlements, always prepared for the possibility that their carefully constructed lives might unravel and force them to defend themselves. "Your mother taught you to handle firearms," Mrs. Diaz observed. Noting the confident way Elena examined the cylinder of a revolver, it wasn't a question. The older woman's sharp eyes missed very little when it came to reading people's histories. "She said a woman who couldn't protect herself was at the mercy of everyone else," Elena replied, checking the weapon's action with movements that spoke of long familiarity. Nara Blackwood may have chosen to live in white settlements, but she never forgot the lessons her own people taught her about survival. Through the kitchen window, they could see Gabriel and Sullivan engaged in heated discussion near the main corral. Sullivan's military bearing contrasted sharply with Gabriel's relaxed rancher stance, but the tension between them was visible even at this distance. Their argument had been raging intermittently since dawn, centering on Sullivan's insistence that the ranch should be evacuated and Gabriel's equally firm refusal to abandon everything he had built. "The captain, he does not understand," Mrs. Diaz said softly, following Elena's gaze. "For him, this is one battle among many. For Senator Harrison, this is his life, his home, his future. A man cannot simply walk away from such things and remain a man." The profound truth in those words resonated deeply with Elena. She had spent her entire adult life walking away from challenges, changing her identity and location whenever the pressure of maintaining her deception became too great. But something had shifted inside her since arriving at Shadow Rock Ranch, whether it was Gabriel's quiet strength, the acceptance she had found among his people, or simply the exhaustion of carrying her secret alone. She found herself unwilling to run again. A commotion outside drew their attention to the yard, where one of the ranch hands was leading a lathered horse toward the barn. The rider who dismounted was unfamiliar to Elena, a young Mexican man whose clothes and equipment suggested he had ridden hard through dangerous territory to reach them. His urgent conversation with Rivera was conducted in rapid Spanish that carried across the morning air like gunfire. "What news does he bring?" Elena asked, though the tension in Mrs. Diaz's face already suggested the answer would not be welcome. "The Wilson Ranch was hit before dawn," the older woman translated grimly. "2 dead, the house burned, cattle scattered." Victor Redhawk left a message carved into what remained of the front door. Elena's blood chilled. What did it say? The half-blood traitors will burn next. Mrs. Diaz crossed herself reflexively. The Wilsons were good people. The wife was part Pueblo. Her husband knew the risks when he married her, but love makes fools of us all. The brutal reality of their situation crystallized in Elena's mind with terrifying clarity. This wasn't simply about raiding for horses and cattle. Victor Redhawk was conducting a campaign of ethnic cleansing, systematically targeting anyone who represented the mixing of native and white bloodlines. The fact that he had specifically mentioned half-blood traitors meant he knew about both Gabriel's heritage and her own presence at the ranch. Sullivan's voice rose sharply in the yard as Rivera delivered the news about the Wilson place. The captain's military training was clearly warring with his concern for his sister's family, creating a conflict that showed in every tense line of his body. When he gestured emphatically toward his small troop of soldiers, Elena could read the argument even without hearing the words. He was offering to escort them to safety at Fort Verde, an offer that Gabriel was obviously rejecting. "Your intended husband is a stubborn man," Mrs. Diaz observed with what might have been admiration. "Like his grandfather, who would not bend even when bending might have saved lives." "Tell me about his grandfather," Elena said, recognizing an opportunity to better understand the man she was supposed to marry. Gabriel mentioned him briefly, but Mrs. Diaz settled into a chair beside the kitchen table, her weathered hands folding over her apron as she prepared to share a story that clearly held deep significance for her. "Joseph Harrison was a man caught between worlds, much like you and Senator Gabriel. He came to this territory as a young prospector, but when he met Louisa, everything changed." The older woman's eyes grew distant as she recalled events from decades past. Louisa was Navajo, the daughter of a respected medicine woman. Their marriage was forbidden by both her people and the white settlers. But Joseph was a man who followed his heart above all else. He built a life where his wife could be herself without fear, though it cost him dearly in other ways. "What happened to them?" Elena asked, though she suspected the story didn't have a happy ending. They had 15 good years together before the tensions between settlers and natives grew too intense. Louisa was killed during a raid on a trading post, not by her own people, but by white vigilantes who saw her as a threat because of her heritage. Joseph never recovered from the loss. He died 3 years later, leaving behind only his son and the determination that his family would never again hide who they were. The story illuminated much about Gabriel's character that had puzzled Elena since her arrival: his willingness to live openly with his mixed heritage, his careful balance between accommodation and authenticity, his absolute refusal to compromise, his principles even in the face of mortal danger. All of it reflected lessons learned from his grandfather's tragic example. "And now, Victor Redhawk threatens to destroy what 2 generations of the Harrison family have built," Elena said quietly. "See," Mrs. Diaz agreed sadly. "But perhaps this time will be different. Perhaps this time, love will prove stronger than hatred." The kitchen door burst open as Thomas Rivera entered with obvious urgency. His usually composed demeanor had been replaced by the kind of controlled alarm that suggested immediate danger. "Señora Senorita, you must come quickly. There's something you need to see." They followed him outside to where Gabriel and Sullivan were examining something that one of the scouts had discovered near the main gate. As they approached, Elena could see it was a message of sorts, a collection of items arranged in a pattern. That would be meaningless to most white observers, but carried deadly significance for anyone familiar with Apache communication methods. A broken arrow pointed toward the house, its shaft painted with red ochre that symbolized blood and death. Beside it lay a small piece of blue cloth that looked suspiciously like it had been torn from a woman's dress. Most ominous of all was a turquoise stone positioned to catch the morning sunlight in a way that would make it visible from a considerable distance. "He knows you're here," Gabriel said quietly to Elena. his voice carrying a weight of resignation and determination. "The cloth and the turquoise, those are meant specifically for you." Sullivan's face had gone pale as he processed the implications. "This changes everything. If Red Hawk is targeting Miss Blackwood specifically, we can't simply defend this. Position. We need to evacuate her immediately." "No," Elena said firmly, surprising everyone with the steel in her voice. "I won't run anymore. I won't let fear dictate my choices or put other people at risk because of my heritage." "Miss Blackwood," Sullivan began with forced patience, "you don't understand the tactical situation. Red Hawk has chosen this ground because it favors his methods of warfare. The ranch is isolated, defensible to a point, but ultimately vulnerable to the kind of sustained assault he specializes in." "Then we make our stand here," Gabriel said quietly, his decision clearly made. "This is our home, our land, our life. If Victor Red Hawk wants to destroy it, he'll have to go through all of us to do it." The declaration sent a chill through the assembled group. Mrs. Diaz crossed herself again, while Rivera nodded grimly, already calculating defensive positions and ammunition supplies. Sullivan's expression shifted through frustration, resignation, and finally a kind of reluctant admiration for his brother-in-law's unwavering resolve. "If you're determined to make this fight," the captain said finally, "then we need to do it properly. My men are trained soldiers, not ranch hands. We can establish proper defensive positions, coordinate fields of fire, set up early warning systems. Your men didn't sign up to protect civilians in a private dispute," Gabriel pointed out. "They signed up to serve the United States Army." Sullivan replied with military precision. "Right now, stopping Victor Red Hawk serves the Army's interests. The specific tactics we use to accomplish that mission are within my discretionary authority." It was a thin justification that probably wouldn't hold up under official scrutiny, but it offered a legal framework for Sullivan to help defend the ranch without openly defying his orders. The brothers-in-law looked at each other across years of estrangement and fundamental disagreement, finding common ground in the immediate need to protect the people and place they both cared about. The next several hours passed in a blur of military-style preparation. Sullivan's soldiers worked with Rivera's ranch hands to establish defensive positions around the compound, using their knowledge of Army tactics to create interlocking fields of fire that would maximize their defensive advantages. Ammunition was distributed, escape routes were planned, and contingency strategies were developed for various assault scenarios. Elena found herself assigned to the ranch house itself, where her primary responsibility would be to protect Mrs. Diaz and maintain communication between the various defensive positions. It was a role that kept her relatively safe while acknowledging her shooting skills, and she suspected it had been carefully chosen to satisfy both Gabriel's protective instincts and her own insistence on participating in the defense. As afternoon faded toward evening, the ranch took on the appearance of a military installation preparing for siege. Sentries were posted at strategic locations, horses were moved to protected areas, and essential supplies were stockpiled in the main house. The normal rhythms of ranch life had been replaced by the controlled tension of soldiers preparing for battle. "Do you think he'll come tonight?" Elena asked Gabriel as they stood together on the front porch, watching the sun set over the hills that surrounded their valley. "Victor operates by his own rules and timing," Gabriel replied thoughtfully. "He might wait days to let the tension build, or he might strike before we finish our preparations. The uncertainty is part of his strategy. It wears down defenders and creates opportunities for mistakes." "You sound like you know him personally." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant ridgeline where the last light of day was painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. "I met him once, years ago, when I was still trying to maintain connections with both sides of my heritage. He was different than angry, yes, but not consumed by the kind of hatred that drives him now." "What changed him?" "The same thing that could have changed any of us," Gabriel said sadly. Too much loss, too much betrayal, too many promises broken by people he trusted. When a person loses everything that defined their identity, sometimes they replace it with something darker. The observation carried weight beyond its immediate context. Elena recognized the implicit warning under different circumstances. With different choices, any of them could have followed the same path. That had led Victor Redhawk to become a figure of terror throughout the territory. A shout from one of the sentries interrupted their contemplation. Riders were approaching from the north, moving fast and making no attempt at concealment. For a moment, everyone tensed for the assault they had been expecting. But the riders carried torches and flew a white flag that suggested parley rather than attack. "He wants to talk," Sullivan observed grimly as he joined them on the porch. "That's either very good news or very bad news, and I'm not sure which." The small party of riders stopped just beyond rifle range, their torches creating pools of flickering light in the gathering darkness. One figure separated from the group and rode slowly forward, his hands clearly visible and empty of weapons. Even at this distance, there was no mistaking the proud bearing and commanding presence of Victor Redhawk. "I would speak with the woman who hides behind a white man's name." His voice carried clearly across the evening air, speaking in the Apache language that Elena understood perfectly. Let her face the judgment of her own people. The challenge was unmistakable, and every eye on the ranch turned toward Elena. This was the moment she had been unconsciously preparing for her entire life. The choice between the safety of continued deception and the terrible honesty of claiming her true heritage in the face of mortal danger. "What is he saying?" Sullivan asked urgently. Elena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her mother's turquoise pendant against her skin like an anchor to her true identity. "He's calling me out," she said quietly. "He wants me to face him as an Apache woman, not as the white settler I've been pretending to be." "You're not going out there," Gabriel said firmly. "Actually," Elena replied, surprising herself with her calm certainty, "I think that's exactly what I'm going to do." The silence that followed Elena's declaration stretched like a bowstring, drawn to its breaking point. Every person on the ranch, soldiers, ranch hands, and family alike, stared at her with expressions ranging from admiration to outright horror. The idea of walking into the darkness to face Victor Redhawk seemed like suicidal courage. Yet something in Elena's bearing suggested this wasn't the desperate gesture it appeared to be. "Absolutely not," Gabriel said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that had built his ranch from nothing. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself to satisfy his twisted sense of justice." "It's not about sacrifice," Elena replied, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the turquoise pendant hidden beneath her collar. "It's about finally being honest about who I am. I've spent my entire life running from my heritage, letting fear dictate my choices. But maybe the only way to end this cycle is to face it directly." Sullivan stepped forward, his military training warring with growing understanding of the cultural complexities at play. "Miss Blackwood, I've seen what Redhawk does to people. He considers traitors. There's no negotiating with that kind of fanaticism." "Perhaps not," Elena acknowledged. "But there might be a way to reach the man he was before hatred consumed him. Gabriel said he wasn't always like this. Maybe if I can speak to him in the language of our shared heritage, remind him of what we're really fighting for." Mrs. Diaz had been listening to the exchange with the patient, a tension of someone who had witnessed decades of similar conflicts. Now she spoke quietly, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "In the old days, before the reservations, disputes like this were sometimes settled by single combat or formal challenge. If the senorita can invoke those traditions, it could work," Rivera added thoughtfully. "Redhawk still honors the old ways, even as he uses them to justify violence. If she approaches him correctly, speaks the proper words, he might be bound by custom to hear her out." Gabriel's expression made it clear he considered this cultural theorizing academic at best and suicidal at worst. You're talking about gambling. Her life on the possibility that a man who has spent years killing innocent people might suddenly rediscover his honor. I'm talking about giving him an opportunity to choose a different path, Elena corrected gently. And if he refuses that opportunity, at least we'll know we tried everything before this becomes a war that destroys everyone we care about. The debate might have continued indefinitely, but Victor Redhawk's voice cut through the night air again, this time speaking English with deliberate precision. I will wait until the moon reaches its highest point. If the woman does not come to face judgment by then, I will consider all who shelter her to be enemies of the Apache people. The ultimatum shifted the entire dynamic of their situation. Instead of having time to prepare defenses and plan strategies, they now faced a deadline that forced immediate decision-making. Sullivan consulted his pocket watch grimly. They had perhaps 2 hours before moonrise. If you're determined to do this, Gabriel said finally, his voice heavy with resignation and fear, then you won't go out there defenseless. And you won't go alone. The challenge was directed specifically at me, Elena protested. If you come with me, it changes the nature of the encounter entirely. I'm not suggesting I accompany you to the meeting, Gabriel clarified. But there are preparations we can make, precautions we can take, ways to give you advantages that don't violate the traditional protocols. Mrs. Diaz nodded approvingly. Your mother's people had rituals for such moments, yes? Ways of invoking protection and demonstrating respect for the old customs. Elena felt a flutter of memory half-forgotten ceremonies her mother had whispered about during the darkest nights of their wandering years. Nara Blackwood had been careful never to practice the old rituals openly, but she had made sure her daughter understood their significance and power. There are certain preparations that could be made, she admitted. Then we make them, Gabriel said firmly. Mrs. Diaz, gather what we'll need for traditional Apache ceremonial dress. Rivera, I want your men positioned to provide clear sight lines during the meeting. Sullivan, your men are to remain completely out of sight but ready to respond if this goes badly. The next hour transformed the ranch into a hive of purposeful activity. Mrs. Diaz, drawing on knowledge passed down through generations of frontier women who had learned to navigate between cultures, assembled items that could serve as ceremonial elements, feathers that had been preserved from the ranch's wild turkeys, white clay that could be used for traditional face painting, and strips of leather that could be fashioned into authentic-looking ceremonial bands. But the most important element came from Elena herself. With trembling fingers, she retrieved her mother's turquoise pendant from its hiding place and slipped it around her neck, where it caught the lamplight with ancient authority. The smooth stone set in silver seemed to pulse with its own life, connecting her to generations of Apache women who had faced impossible choices with courage and dignity. Tell me about the pendant, Gabriel said softly as Mrs. Diaz helped Elena prepare for the encounter. They had moved to the ranch house's main bedroom, where privacy allowed for the kind of intimate conversation that the coming confrontation might make impossible. It belonged to my grandmother, then my mother, and now me, Elena explained, touching the stone gently. The turquoise represents the sky and water life-giving forces. The silver setting shows the 4 directions and the path of the sun. It's meant to guide the wearer through difficult journeys. Gabriel studied the simple but powerful piece with respectful attention. It's beautiful. Victor will recognize its significance immediately. That's what I'm counting on, Elena admitted. Whatever else he's become, he was raised with the same traditions that created this pendant. Maybe seeing it will remind him that we're part of something larger than this conflict. Mrs. Diaz finished applying the white clay marks to Elena's cheekbones, traditional patterns that identified her as a woman seeking to speak truth in a formal setting. The transformation was startling. Where moments before had stood a refined Eastern lady in frontier dress, there now sat an Apache woman prepared to face the judgment of her people. "You look like your mother must have," Gabriel said quietly. "Proud, beautiful, and absolutely unbreakable." The compliment sent warmth through Elena's chest, but it was tinged with the cold reality of what lay ahead. In less than an hour, she would walk out into the darkness to face a man who had dedicated his life to destroying people like her. Success would mean finding a path to peace that preserved everyone she had come to care about. Failure would mean death, not just for her, but potentially for everyone at Shadow Rock Ranch. A soft knock at the door announced Sullivan, who entered with obvious reluctance to interrupt their preparations. "There's something you should know before you face Red Hawk," he said grimly. "One of the men who rode with him, I recognized him from my days at Fort Apache. Frank Dawson. He was with the Cavalry Scouts for many years, working both sides of the Indian troubles." "Who?" Elena asked, though something in Sullivan's expression suggested the answer would not be welcome. "Dawson was dishonorably discharged for selling information to raiding parties," Sullivan continued. "If he's involved, this whole encounter could be an elaborate trap." The revelation cast Elena's planned confrontation in an entirely different light. Instead of a traditional challenge governed by cultural protocols, she might be walking into a carefully planned ambush, designed to eliminate the ranch's defenders through deception rather than direct assault. All the more reason to approach this carefully, Gabriel said. "Elena, if you sense anything wrong, anything at all, you retreat immediately. Honor and tradition are meaningless if you're dead." "Understood," she agreed, though privately she wondered if retreat would even be possible once she committed to the meeting. Men like Victor Redhawk didn't offer second chances to people they considered traitors. The moon was rising toward its zenith when Elena finally emerged from the ranch house, transformed from Eastern lady to Apache diplomat warrior. The traditional elements of her appearance, the ceremonial markings, the turquoise pendant, the feather woven into her dark hair, created a visual statement that spoke to cultural pride rather than attempted deception. Gabriel walked beside her to the edge of the ranch compound, his hand resting lightly on the grip of his holstered pistol. The gesture was unconscious, a reflection of his deep reluctance to let her face this danger alone, but it also represented the kind of protective instinct that could destroy her chances of success if Victor interpreted it as a sign of white interference in Apache affairs. "Remember," she said softly as they paused at the boundary of torchlight, "whatever happens out there, don't interfere unless it's absolutely clear that I'm in mortal danger. This has to be between Victor and me, or it won't work. And if it doesn't work?" Elena turned to face him fully, memorizing his features in case this was the last time she would see them clearly. "Then at least we'll have tried to solve this honorably. Sometimes that's all we can do." The kiss they shared was brief but intense, carrying all the words they hadn't had time to speak and all the promises they might never have the chance to keep. When they separated, Elena saw her own fears and hopes reflected in Gabriel's dark eyes, along with something else, a kind of fierce pride in her courage that gave her strength for what lay ahead. The walk across the open ground between the ranch and Victor's position felt like crossing between two different worlds. With each step away from the circle of friendly torchlight, Elena left behind the safety of her assumed identity and moved closer to a confrontation with the heritage she had spent her adult life denying. The turquoise pendant seemed to grow warmer against her skin, as if responding to her proximity to someone who would understand its true significance. Victor Redhawk waited exactly where she had expected, seated on his horse with the kind of patient stillness that spoke of absolute confidence in his position. In the moonlight, she could see that he was older than she remembered from her childhood, his face marked by years of conflict and loss. But his bearing still carried the unmistakable authority of a war leader who had never known defeat. "So," he said in Apache as she approached within speaking distance, the daughter of Nara Black. Fawn finally shows her true face. I wondered if years of living among the White Eyes had completely destroyed your courage. The use of her mother's Apache name hit Elena like a physical blow. She had almost forgotten that Nara had once been known by a different identity before. Love and circumstance had transformed her into the woman who had raised her daughter to navigate between cultures. I honor the memory of Nara Black Fawn, Elena replied in the same language, her pronunciation rusty but serviceable. And I honor the traditions that taught her daughter the difference between courage and foolishness. Victor's expression shifted slightly, perhaps recognizing that this conversation would be more complex than he had anticipated. You still speak our language, that is unexpected. Most who choose the white path forget the words of their people as quickly as they forget their obligations. I have forgotten neither, Elena said firmly, raising the turquoise pendant so the moonlight caught it. I carry the symbols of our people with me always, even when circumstances require me to honor them quietly. The sight of the traditional jewelry seemed to affect Victor more than her words had. His rigid posture softened slightly, and for a moment she glimpsed the man he might have been in a different world, a leader shaped by wisdom rather than consumed by revenge. That pendant belonged to Morning Star, your grandmother, he said quietly. I remember when she wore it at the council meetings, when we still believed the white government might honor its promises. She died believing that peace was possible. Elena replied, my mother died believing the same thing. I stand here tonight because I share that belief, even in the face of evidence that might suggest otherwise. Victor's laugh was bitter, but not entirely without warmth. Peace, you sound like the missionaries who came to teach us that turning the other cheek would somehow protect us from bullets and disease. Where did that faith lead your mother, daughter of Morning Star? Where did it lead our people? It led my mother to love, to family, to a daughter who stands here tonight still believing that our heritage means more than hatred, Elena answered. It led our people to survival, even when survival required adapting to circumstances beyond our control. The philosophical challenge hung in the night air between them, carrying implications that extended far beyond their personal confrontation. This was the fundamental question that had divided Native communities throughout the frontier period, whether resistance through violence or adaptation through compromise offered the better path to cultural survival. Survival through betrayal is not survival at all, Victor said finally. It is a kind of death that leaves the body breathing while killing the soul. And survival through endless war is not survival either, Elena countered. It is a kind of madness that destroys everything we claim to be protecting. For several heartbeats, the only sounds were the distant voices of night birds and the soft stamping of horses. Then Victor dismounted, his movements deliberate and ceremonial. And Elena realized that the true confrontation was only beginning. Victor Redhawk's dismount transformed their encounter from a distant confrontation into something far more intimate and dangerous. Standing on the same ground, separated by only a few yards of moonlit prairie grass, Elena could see the full weight of years and loss etched into his weathered features. This was not the mindless killer of newspaper accounts, but a man whose every scar told a story of dreams destroyed and promises broken. You have your grandmother's eyes, he said quietly, switching to English as if acknowledging that their conversation had moved beyond simple cultural challenge. Morning Star could see truth in people's hearts even when they tried to hide it from themselves. Can you see the truth in mine, daughter of her blood? The question carried layers of meaning that made Elena's breath catch. Victor wasn't simply asking her to understand his motivations. He was inviting her to judge whether the path he had chosen served any purpose beyond satisfying his own rage. It was the kind of vulnerability that could be either an opening for peace or a trap designed to lower her guard. I see a man who has lost everything he valued, she replied carefully, and who has chosen to let that loss define what he has become. But I also see someone who still remembers my grandmother's name, which suggests that not everything good in him has been destroyed by hatred. Victor's smile was sharp as winter moonlight. Careful, morning star's granddaughter. Sympathy can be a dangerous weakness when dealing with men like me. And bitter cynicism can be a dangerous weakness when dealing with women like me, she countered, allowing steel to enter her voice. I didn't come out here to offer you pity, Victor Redhawk. I came to offer you a choice. Behind them, she could sense rather than see the tension radiating from the ranch buildings. Gabriel would be watching through field glasses, every muscle coiled for action if the confrontation turned violent. Sullivan and his soldiers would have rifles trained on Victor's position, ready to intervene despite her explicit instructions. The awareness of all those watching eyes added pressure to every word she spoke, knowing that mistakes here could trigger a bloodbath that would consume everyone she had come to care about. A choice, Victor repeated, as if tasting the word. For hidden meaning. What choice could you possibly offer that I haven't already considered and rejected? The choice to be remembered as something other than a killer of innocence, Elena said bluntly. The choice to use your remaining years to build something lasting instead of simply destroying what others have built. Victor's expression darkened. You sound like the peace commissioners who came to the reservation, full of fine words about cooperation and mutual benefit. Where are those commissioners now, Morning Star's granddaughter? Where are the promises they made to our people? Some of them are dead, killed by their own kind for trying to honor those promises, Elena replied, drawing on stories her mother had told during their wandering years. Others are fighting in Washington, trying to create policies that might actually protect what remains of our people. And some of them learned, as I learned, that sometimes the most effective way to serve your people is to work within the systems that oppress them rather than simply raging against them. The philosophical challenge struck home in ways that purely emotional appeals had not. Victor's posture shifted, and Elena recognized the stance of a man forced to confront uncomfortable questions about his own choices. But before he could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the delicate balance of their conversation. Frank Dawson materialized from the darkness like an evil spirit, his horse moving with the practiced silence of a man who had spent years learning to kill from ambush. The former cavalry scout's presence changed everything about the encounter, bringing an element of calculated malice that had been absent from Victor's more straightforward challenge. Enough talk, Dawson said in accented English, his hand resting meaningfully on his rifle. The woman has heard our terms. Kill the rancher, abandon the land, and she might live to see another sunrise. Refuse, and we burn everything. Elena felt ice form in her stomach as she realized that Victor's willingness to engage in traditional challenge protocols had been undermined by his advisor's more pragmatic approach to the problem. Dawson represented everything ugly about the frontier conflicts, a man who had profited from violence on all sides, and who saw cultural identity as just another weapon to be exploited. This is not your fight, Frank, Victor said sharply, but there was an undertone of uncertainty that suggested the dynamics between them were more complex than simple leadership, isn't it? Dawson replied with mock surprise. I've invested considerable time and effort in building your reputation as a scourge of mixed-blood traitors. That reputation is valuable, Victor. It opens doors, creates opportunities, generates the kind of fear that makes our work easier. The casual admission that Victor's campaign of terror had been orchestrated for profit rather than principle hit Elena like a physical blow. The man she had been trying to reach with appeals to honor and tradition was revealed to be at least partially the puppet of someone who cared nothing for Apache culture beyond its usefulness as a tool for intimidation. You're using him, she said to Dawson, her voice carrying a mixture of disgust and dawning understanding. You're using his pain and anger to build your own power. And when he's served your purposes, you'll discard him like you've discarded everyone else. Dawson's grin was wolfish. The girl is smarter than she looks, Yes, I use Victor's reputation. And yes, I profit from the fear his name generates. But don't mistake me for some heartless manipulator, Senorita. Victor chose this path long before. I offered to help him walk it more efficiently. Chose it, or was pushed onto it by men like you who saw opportunity in his grief? Elena challenged. The question struck deeper than she had intended. Victor's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, and finally a kind of terrible recognition. For the first time since the confrontation began, she saw cracks in the armor of righteousness that had sustained his campaign of vengeance. Enough philosophy, Dawson snapped, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. You have 1 minute to give us your answer, Senorita. Submit to our justice or watch everyone you care about burn. But Victor raised a hand, stopping his advisor's ultimatum. No, Frank, let her speak. I want to hear what Morningstar's granddaughter believes is worth more than the blood of our people. The opening was small but significant. Victor was reasserting control over the encounter, pushing back against Dawson's attempts to reduce it to simple extortion. Elena seized the moment, knowing it might be her only chance to reach the man beneath the legend. I believe in the vision my grandmother carried to those council meetings, she said, her voice rising with conviction. I believe that our people's greatest strength has always been our ability to adapt without losing what makes us who we are. The buffalo are gone, Victor. The old hunting grounds are cut by railroads and fences. We can rage against those changes until we die, or we can find new ways to honor the spirits of our ancestors. And what would those new ways look like? Victor asked, genuine curiosity replacing some of the hostility in his tone. They would look like Gabriel Harrison building a ranch that respects the land instead of simply exploiting it, Elena replied. They would look like mixed-blood families raising children who know both worlds and can navigate between them safely. They would look like people like us proving that heritage and progress don't have to be enemies. Dawson's laugh was as harsh as breaking glass. Pretty words, but the white world will never accept you as equals. They'll use you when it's convenient and discard you when it's not. At least my way, we take what we can and make them pay for every inch of ground they steal. Your way leads nowhere but more graves, Elena shot back. How many innocent people have died to feed your profit margins, Frank? How many children have lost parents? How many families have been destroyed all so you could maintain the reputation that keeps you in business? The accusation clearly struck home. Dawson's casual mask slipped for a moment, revealing something uglier beneath. A man who had long ago abandoned any pretense of principle in favor of simple greed, but it also revealed how precarious his position really was. Without Victor's mystique as a warrior defending Apache honor, Dawson was just another frontier criminal. Victor, Elena continued, pressing her advantage, you've seen what Frank's way leads to. The Wilson family, were they your enemies, or just convenient targets that served his purposes? How many more innocents will die before you admit that? This path serves nothing but his bank account. The silence that followed was filled with tension so thick it seemed to have physical weight. Victor's internal struggle was visible in every line of his body as he wrestled with questions that clearly had been haunting him for some time. Dawson, recognizing the danger to his carefully constructed influence, moved his hand closer to his weapon. Enough, Dawson barked. Victor, if you're too weak to do what's necessary, I'll handle this myself. The former scout's rifle was halfway to his shoulder when Victor's voice cut through the night air like a blade. Put it down, Frank. What? I said, put it down. This is still my fight, and I'll decide how it ends. The confrontation between the two men created a moment of deadly uncertainty. Dawson's eyes darted between Victor and Elena, calculating odds and assessing threats. Whatever he saw in Victor's expression convinced him that direct disobedience would be suicidal, but his reluctant compliance carried the promise of future conflict. You're making a mistake, my friend. Dawson said as he lowered his rifle. "The woman is poison. She'll fill your head with dreams of peace while the White Army prepares to hunt us down like animals." "Perhaps," Victor replied quietly. "But that's my choice to make." The shift in power dynamics created an opening that Elena knew she had to exploit carefully. Victor had reasserted control over the situation, but his alliance with Dawson was clearly fracturing under the weight of competing agendas. If she could widen that crack, there might be a path to resolution that didn't require bloodshed. "There's something else you should know, Victor," she said quietly. "The man who's been offering me protection at the ranch, Gabriel Harrison, he's not just another white rancher trying to profit from stolen land. His grandmother was Navajo, married to a white prospector who respected her traditions. He's mixed blood, like us, like everyone who's trying to build a life that honors both sides of their heritage. He understands the same struggles you faced, the same choices that have shaped your life. The difference is that he's chosen to build, rather than destroy. And where has that choice led him?" Dawson interjected venomously. "To a ranch that exists at the sufferance of white neighbors who would turn on him the moment it became convenient. To a life spent hiding his true nature and pretending to be something he's not. A life spent proving that people like us can succeed without abandoning everything that makes us who we are," Elena countered. "A community that respects him for his character rather than judging him for his bloodline. The possibility that our children might inherit a world where they don't have to choose between their heritage and their future." The vision she painted clearly affected Victor in ways that surprised even her. The hardened war leader's expression softened as he considered possibilities that his years of conflict had forced him to abandon. But Dawson's growing agitation suggested that this philosophical awakening threatened everything he had worked to build. "Pretty dreams," the former scout said dismissively. "But dreams don't stop bullets or feed families or protect women from men who see mixed blood as an invitation to violence." "No," Elena agreed. "But they give us something worth fighting for besides revenge. They give us hope that the cycle of violence can be broken instead of simply perpetuated." Victor was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Elena and the distant lights of Shadow Rock Ranch. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of decision that made both companions lean forward in anticipation. "I will speak with this mixed-blood rancher," he said slowly. "If he is truly what you claim, if he has found a way to honor both sides of his heritage while building something lasting, then perhaps there are alternatives I have not considered." Dawson's face went pale with fury. "Victor, you can't be serious. After everything we've built, everything we've accomplished, you're going to throw it all away for the pretty words of a woman who's betrayed her own people?" "I'm going to explore possibilities that might serve our people better than endless war," Victor replied firmly. "If that threatens your business interests, Frank, perhaps it's time for us to reconsider our partnership." The threat was unmistakable, and Dawson's hand drifted toward his weapon again. But before the situation could explode into violence, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of new players in this deadly game. Riders were coming from multiple directions, their torches creating a constellation of moving lights in the darkness. "It seems our private conversation is about to become very public," Victor observed grimly. As the riders drew closer, Elena could make out the details that identified them: federal marshals from the east, territorial militia from the south, and what appeared to be a delegation of Apache leaders from the reservation to the west. The convergence of so many different factions at this exact moment and place suggested that word of Victor's activities had reached far beyond the local community. This was planned, she realized aloud. Someone arranged for all these groups to arrive here tonight. Dawson's triumphant smile provided the answer. "Did you really think I would allow sentiment to interfere with business? One way or another, this ends tonight. Either Victor maintains his reputation by dealing with the traitors as promised, or he faces the consequences of disappointing very powerful people who have invested heavily in his success. The trap was closing around all of them, and Elena realized that her confrontation with Victor had been manipulated from the beginning to serve Dawson's agenda. Whether it ended in violence or reconciliation, the former scout had arranged for witnesses who would ensure the outcome served his purposes. But as the various factions converged on their position, Victor Redhawk's expression shifted to something she had not seen before. Not the rage of a warrior or the calculation of a strategist, but the quiet determination of a man who had finally decided to stop being used by others and start making his own choices about how his story would end. The convergence of multiple factions transformed the moonlit prairie into a stage where the future of the entire territory would be decided. Federal Marshal Bennett arrived first, his small contingent of deputies spreading out in professional formation that spoke of years fighting frontier conflicts. Behind him came Major Wilson of the Territorial Militia, leading 24 mounted soldiers whose nervous energy suggested they expected immediate combat. But it was the third group that commanded everyone's attention, 3 Apache leaders from the reservation, led by the imposing figure of Chief White Cloud, whose presence transformed this from a simple law enforcement action into something approaching a formal tribunal. "Victor Redhawk," Marshal Bennett called out, his voice carrying the authority of federal law across the tense silence. "You're under arrest for murder, arson, and armed insurrection against the territorial government." "And you, Marshal," Chief White Cloud added in heavily accented English, "are trespassing on a matter that falls under tribal jurisdiction. Victor Redhawk is Apache. His actions reflect on our people, and his judgment must be rendered by our council." Dawson's triumphant expression flickered as he realized that his carefully orchestrated trap had become far more complex than he had anticipated. Instead of simple military action that would eliminate Victor and anyone who sheltered him, competing jurisdictions now created legal complications that could derail his entire scheme. Elena stood at the center of the converging forces, acutely aware that the next few minutes would determine not only her own fate, but the future of everyone at Shadow Rock Ranch. More importantly, she realized that this moment represented a crossroads for the entire question of how mixed heritage people would be treated in the emerging frontier society. "There's a fourth option," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled groups. "One that serves everyone's interests better than the alternatives you're proposing." Marshal Bennett's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Miss, this is a federal matter. I appreciate your concern, but—" "My name is Elena Blackwood," she interrupted. Firmly, granddaughter of Morning Star, daughter of Nara Black Fawn, and the woman Victor Redhawk came here to judge. "If anyone has standing to speak at this tribunal, it's me." The announcement sent ripples of reaction through all the assembled groups. Chief White Cloud's expression shifted to one of surprised recognition. Morning Star had been a respected figure in tribal politics before the reservation period, and her granddaughter's presence added legitimacy to any proceeding that claimed traditional authority. "You are Morning Star's blood?" the chief asked in Apache, his tone carrying new respect. "I am," Elena replied in the same language, "and I invoke the right of family to speak for the accused before judgment is rendered." Victor's eyes widened as he recognized the traditional legal framework she was invoking. Under old Apache law, family members had the right to present evidence and arguments before tribal justice was administered. It was an ancient protection, designed to ensure that personal conflicts didn't override community interests. "This is ridiculous," Major Wilson interjected. "We're not here to play games with savage customs. Redhawk is a wanted criminal, and he's going to hang for his crimes regardless of what his grandmother's cousin has to say about it." The casual dismissal of tribal traditions as savage customs created exactly the kind of inflammatory moment that Elena had been hoping to avoid. But it also provided an opportunity to demonstrate the fundamental differences between the various approaches to justice being offered. Major Wilson, Chief White Cloud said with dangerous quiet, you would do well to remember that you are a guest on land that was Apache long before it was Arizona, and may be Apache again long after your territorial government has been forgotten. The implicit threat was unmistakable, and suddenly the assembled groups found themselves facing the possibility of a much larger conflict than anyone had anticipated. Dawson's expression showed growing alarm as he realized that his simple scheme was spiraling beyond his control. Perhaps, Marshal Bennett said carefully, we should allow Miss Blackwood to speak her piece before we proceed with any precipitous actions. It was a diplomatic solution that gave everyone time to assess the situation while avoiding immediate confrontation. Elena nodded gratefully, knowing that this might be her only chance to present an alternative that could satisfy all the competing interests. Victor Redhawk stands accused of crimes against the territorial government, she began, her voice carrying across the moonlit gathering. But before we proceed to judgment, we should examine whether those crimes were committed of his own free will, or whether he was manipulated by others who profited from his pain. She turned to face Dawson directly, noting how the former scout's hand drifted to his weapon again. Frank Dawson has spent the past 3 years building Victor's reputation as a scourge of mixed-blood families. Not because he cares about Apache honor, but because that reputation serves his business interests. That's a serious accusation, miss, Marshal Bennett said. Do you have evidence to support it? I have Victor's own testimony, if he's willing to give it honestly, Elena replied. Tell them, Victor. Tell them how Dawson first approached you, what he promised, and what he's really been using your anger to accomplish. Victor was silent. For a long moment, his internal struggle visible to everyone present. Finally, he spoke in a voice heavy with reluctant recognition. Frank came to me after my wife and children died when the reservation was struck by smallpox. He said the disease had been introduced deliberately by white settlers who wanted to clear the land for development. He offered to help me seek justice. And what form did that justice take? Chief White Cloud asked gently. At first, we targeted only those who had actually profited from our people's suffering, corrupt Indian agents, dishonest traders, land speculators who used false documents to steal reservation territory. Victor's voice grew harder as he continued. But Frank always pushed for more violent methods, claiming that mercy was seen as weakness by our enemies. When did it change from seeking justice to terrorizing innocents? Elena pressed. Victor's shoulders sagged under the weight of unwelcome memories. When Frank started providing intelligence about mixed-blood families, he said they were the greatest threat to our people's survival because they gave whites an excuse to claim they were accommodating Indian interests while actually destroying our culture. And you believed him? Chief White Cloud asked, his tone carrying disappointment rather than condemnation. I wanted to believe him, Victor admitted. My pain was so great that any explanation for it seemed preferable to accepting that sometimes terrible things happen without reason or purpose. Dawson's face had gone pale as he realized that Victor's confession was destroying the carefully constructed narrative that had sustained their partnership. This is all very touching, he said, with forced casualness, but it doesn't change the fact that Victor chose his actions. No one forced him to kill those people. No one forced him, Elena agreed. But someone certainly guided him toward targets that served purposes beyond simple revenge. Tell us, Frank, what did you gain from Victor's reputation? Who paid you to ensure that mixed-blood families remained isolated and vulnerable? The question struck home with devastating accuracy. Dawson's composure finally cracked completely, revealing the calculating opportunist beneath the facade of principled advisor. You don't understand the forces at work here, he snarled. There are people with significant investments in this territory who need the Indian problem resolved permanently. Half-breeds like you just complicate the process by making it harder to maintain clear racial boundaries. Marshal Bennett stepped forward, his hand moving to his own weapon. Are you telling us that you've been orchestrating terrorist attacks to serve the interests of land speculators? I'm telling you that. Some problems require creative solutions, Dawson replied, his mask of civility completely abandoned. Victor was a useful tool for maintaining the kind of instability that makes territorial acquisition more profitable for the right investors. The admission sent shockwaves through all the assembled groups. Chief White Cloud's expression darkened, with rage at the revelation that his people's suffering had been deliberately amplified for economic gain. Major Wilson looked genuinely stunned by the implications for territorial security. Even Marshal Bennett, accustomed to frontier corruption, seemed shaken by the scope of the conspiracy. But it was Victor's reaction that commanded everyone's attention. The proud war leader's face went through a series of emotions: shock, rage, and finally a kind of terrible understanding of how completely he had been used. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man confronting the full magnitude of his betrayal. "You made me into a monster to serve your profit margins," he said quietly. "You took my grief for my family and twisted it into a weapon against innocents who shared nothing but bloodline with those who had wronged me. I gave you purpose," Dawson shot back desperately. "Without me, you would have drunk yourself to death on the reservation, like so many others." "You gave me an excuse to avoid the hard work of healing," Victor corrected grimly. "And now good people are dead because I was too weak to face my pain honestly." The confession created a moment of profound silence as everyone present processed the implications of what they had heard. Dawson's scheme was exposed, Victor's motivations were revealed, and the fundamental question of justice remained. What should be done with a man who had committed terrible crimes while under the influence of deliberate manipulation? Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us,